The city of Washington, D.C., at night in the late 1980s was a place of contradiction, monuments of power glowing under soft floodlights, while only a few miles away, neighborhoods trembled under the pulse of the drug trade. Somewhere between those worlds moved a man known in whispers and legends, Wayne "Silk" Perry. His name traveled through the streets like a chill in the air, carried in quiet tones among hustlers, police, and anyone who understood what true fear meant. Some said he was a ghost, others swore they'd seen him step from the shadows just before chaos unfolded. To the people who lived through those nights, Silk wasn't just a man, he was a myth made flesh. Wayne Perry's story begins not with glamour, but with silence. A silence that was both calm and deadly, the kind of quiet that falls right before something irreversible happens. He was the man behind many of D.C.'s most notorious underworld moments, a figure who operated in the background of one of America's most dangerous eras. His legend wasn't written in headlines or on street corners, it was carved into memory through fear, loyalty, and the rules of a code that few could live by and fewer could survive breaking. When people spoke his name, they did it carefully, as if even saying it too loud could draw unwanted attention from forces they couldn't control. At the height of Washington's drug-fueled chaos, the streets were divided by power, money, and territory. Every corner had its own ruler, every block its own soldiers. But above all of them were the enforcers, those who made sure words were kept and debts were paid. Silk Perry was one of them, and in time, he became the standard by which others measured themselves. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't loud. He was methodical, composed, and, as his nickname suggested, smooth. Even in the most violent situations, his calm demeanor never cracked. That calm was what made him terrifying, because those who truly understood violence never needed to shout. In those days, D.C. was transforming. The political capital of the United States was also becoming one of its murder capitals. Crack cocaine had flooded the city, and with it came chaos, power struggles, and unimaginable profit. The police were overwhelmed, communities lived in fear. And amid this turbulence rose a quiet man whose loyalty made him indispensable to the people who ruled the streets. When Harlem's drug kingpin, Alpo Martinez, expanded into Washington, he found in Perry not just protection, but a partner, a soldier whose loyalty ran so deep it bordered on devotion. It was this partnership that would seal both of their fates, linking their names forever in the story of D.C.'s criminal underworld. But this story is not one of glamour or heroism. It's a meditation on power, loyalty, and the high price of reputation. It's about how a man becomes both a legend and a prisoner of his own image. Beneath the myth of Silk Perry lies the human being, one who was shaped by his environment, his choices, and the silent rules of a world where weakness could mean death. The streets called him a killer, but to those close to him, he was something else, disciplined, intelligent, loyal beyond comprehension. Every action he took came from a deep understanding of survival, a truth learned not from books, but from the rhythm of the streets themselves. Imagine a night in 1989, rain tapping gently against the windows of an old sedan parked under a dim streetlight. Inside, a man sits quietly, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the reflection of the city's lights in the wet pavement. That man is Silk Perry. No rush, no panic, just stillness. The world outside is chaos, but inside that car, there's focus. It's in these moments that his legend was built, not through words, but through presence. People said he could walk into a room full of tension and make everyone else fall silent without saying a word. That kind of power doesn't come from fear alone, it comes from understanding how people move when they're desperate, and how silence can speak louder than a threat. As the story unfolds, you'll walk through the same streets that made and destroyed men like Perry. You'll see the rise of his name, the building of an empire under Alpo's shadow, and the slow unraveling that followed when loyalty was tested by survival. His life mirrors the city itself, beautiful on the surface, turbulent underneath. This is not just a tale of crime, it's the anatomy of an era, a meditation on choices, consequences, and the strange peace that comes when everything you've built begins to fall apart. And as you listen, as your mind drifts between curiosity and calm, remember, every legend begins somewhere quiet, in the dark, with a man who learns how to move through the world like silk. What happened to Wayne "Silk" Perry in the end is no secret, but how he got there, how he became both feared and revered, remains one of D.C.'s most haunting stories. His silence, his loyalty, and his inevitable fall form the rhythm of a life lived on the edge of morality and madness. And though decades have passed since his name last echoed through the city's backstreets, the legend hasn't faded. It lingers like a faint hum under the city's heartbeat, a reminder that some ghosts never leave, they just learn to move quieter. The streets of Washington, D.C., in the late 1960s were a world of contradictions, grand marble monuments standing just miles from neighborhoods where poverty and frustration shaped young lives. Amidst this backdrop of political power and urban struggle, a boy named Wayne Perry was growing up. His surroundings were not filled with luxury or comfort but with lessons in survival. Row houses leaned tiredly against one another, sidewalks cracked beneath the pressure of time, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the sound of police sirens, laughter, and arguments echoing through narrow streets. For kids like Wayne, the city was both a playground and a battlefield, and every day demanded that you learn how to stand your ground. As a child, Wayne had an aura that made people notice him. Even in his early years, neighbors described him as sharp-eyed and composed, with a stillness beyond his age. He was quiet, observant, and deliberate, traits that would one day define him as Silk. He watched everything, how people moved, how they talked, how they survived. In a city where respect meant protection and weakness invited danger, Wayne learned early that control was everything. His family, like many others, faced the daily weight of financial struggle. His mother worked tirelessly to keep things steady, while his father's influence, whether through presence or absence, shaped Wayne's understanding of masculinity, pride, and endurance. In those formative years, sports were one of the few escapes the neighborhood offered. Basketball courts became arenas where reputations were made, where every shot carried the pressure of pride. Wayne played with intensity but never arrogance. Even when he lost, he didn't show frustration. That composure was already becoming his trademark. Friends remembered how he could defuse a fight with just a look, how his calm presence made others hesitate. There was something unnerving about how still he could be in a world that thrived on chaos. This quiet confidence drew people toward him. Even as a boy, he carried himself like someone older, someone who already understood the code of the streets. By the time he reached his teenage years, the D.C. of Wayne's childhood had changed dramatically. The economy was struggling, and drugs were beginning to flood communities that once held tighter together. The early seeds of the crack epidemic were being sown, and opportunities for young black men were limited. For many, the choice wasn't between right and wrong, it was between survival and disappearance. Wayne, like countless others, felt the pull of the streets, the magnetic rhythm of fast money and visible respect. But unlike many who dove headfirst, he observed first. He studied who moved the smartest, who lasted the longest. That patience, rare among the impulsive energy of youth, would become one of his defining traits. As his presence grew in the neighborhood, so did his reputation. People began calling him Silk not because of what he did, but because of how he did it. He was smooth, unshaken, and efficient. There was a grace to his movements, whether on the basketball court, at the corner, or during tense moments when others lost their composure. The name fit perfectly. Silk wasn't loud or flamboyant, he was quiet strength personified. He didn't need to shout to be heard. When Silk spoke, people listened, not out of fear, but out of respect. His words carried the weight of someone who measured them carefully, never wasting energy on noise. In the background of his adolescence, D.C. was changing fast. Poverty deepened as industries left, crime rates climbed, and tension between residents and police intensified. The line between survival and destruction blurred a little more each year. Young men who once dreamed of sports or steady work began to drift toward the lucrative but dangerous lure of hustling. Wayne wasn't immune to that pull, but even then, he approached it differently. While others chased immediate gain, he understood the importance of reputation. Every move he made was deliberate, every relationship considered. He was building something long before he knew what it would become. Friends and elders in the community began to notice his growing influence. Some warned him to stay away from the darker side of the streets, to use his intelligence and composure for something greater. But the truth was, opportunity rarely knocked on doors like his. The system had already set boundaries around what a young man from his block could become. School wasn't built for kids like Wayne, it was a temporary stop before reality came calling. And in a world where power meant security, the path of the street soldier began to look less like rebellion and more like destiny. Still, there was a code within Wayne, even then. He believed in fairness, in respect, in looking after those close to him. He hated unnecessary cruelty and valued loyalty above everything. These principles, however warped by the life he would later live, were formed during these early years, through the struggles of his family, the lessons learned from street corners, and the cold clarity that came with watching people lose themselves to desperation. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, D.C. began to burn brighter and darker at once. Money started flowing through illegal channels, and power shifted toward those who controlled it. For a young man like Wayne Perry, this was the turning point, the moment when the boy who had mastered calm became the man who could command fear. Yet even as he stepped closer to the underworld, he carried something that set him apart: patience, intelligence, and a strange serenity in the face of chaos. The streets were shaping him, and he was shaping them back. Every night, under the hum of flickering streetlights, he learned a little more about loyalty, trust, and betrayal. He began to understand that in this city, survival wasn't about strength, it was about balance, about knowing when to move and when to stay still. Long before the world would know his name, before Alpo Martinez and the empire that would follow, Wayne "Silk" Perry was already becoming a legend, not through violence or fame, but through presence. His story had begun not in the noise of crime, but in the quiet determination of a boy learning to control the chaos around him. And soon, that calm would become his greatest weapon. By the time Wayne Perry entered his late teens, the streets had already started calling him by a new name: Silk. It wasn't a nickname given for flash or style, but for something far more rare: composure. In a world where tempers burned fast and violence was often the first answer, Wayne moved differently. He was smooth in conversation, deliberate in motion, and impossibly calm when everyone else panicked. People said he walked like a man with nothing to prove. His voice never rose, his tone never cracked. There was an aura about him that made even the loudest hustlers lower their voices. "That's Silk," they'd whisper, not out of fear just yet, but out of respect, the kind that can't be bought, only earned. The story of how Wayne became Silk was not written in one moment. It unfolded quietly, through dozens of encounters that revealed who he was becoming. On street corners where arguments could turn deadly over a few dollars, Silk was the rare presence who could diffuse tension without a single threat. If someone owed money or disrespected his people, he didn't shout or curse. He simply showed up, looked the man in the eyes, and let silence do the work. That silence carried more weight than any weapon. It was discipline, a word not often used in those circles, but one that defined him more than anything else. Silk was a student of people. He watched their eyes, their hands, the way they spoke when they were nervous. In a place where everyone was trying to be unpredictable, he became the one who could predict everyone. D.C. in the early 1980s was changing fast. Crack cocaine had begun to sweep through the neighborhoods like wildfire. Blocks that once knew community and rhythm now pulsed with new money, new danger, and new rules. For those growing up in it, survival meant adaptation. Silk watched how power shifted, how one man's arrogance could get him killed, how another's caution could keep him alive. He started aligning himself not with the loudest, but the smartest. While others craved attention, he valued invisibility. He understood that being seen too much was a liability. So he stayed low, stayed quiet, and built relationships that would later become his foundation. The same calm that made him a mystery also made him indispensable. By his early 20s, Silk had earned something money couldn't buy, a reputation. When people said, "Silk's around," it meant order would follow. He wasn't yet the feared enforcer he would become, but the early traces of that role were already visible. He could handle a situation without drawing police attention, settle disputes without making a scene. He understood that power in the streets wasn't about how many people you hurt, it was about how many people listened when you spoke. That understanding made him valuable to older hustlers who recognized in him a kind of discipline the younger generation lacked. They started bringing him closer, involving him in business, not as muscle, but as a trusted presence. He learned the structure of street economics, how loyalty was both currency and curse. But the name, Silk, wasn't all reputation. It was personality too. There was an ease about him that disarmed people. Women described him as charming, confident without arrogance. Men respected him because he never acted above anyone. Even as his influence grew, he never carried himself like a boss, he preferred being the man behind the curtain. His clothes were clean but understated, his words measured. He didn't smoke or drink excessively. He was focused, always watching, always calculating. That calm presence began to separate him from his peers, and in the unpredictable rhythm of D.C.'s street life, that difference was everything. Still, beneath that cool surface was something dangerous. Silk had learned early that kindness was often mistaken for weakness. He could be patient, but when crossed, his response was swift and final. It was this balance, mercy and menace, that made people both trust and fear him. There were whispers that he handled problems for certain crews, that when Silk got involved, things stopped escalating. No one ever saw him lose control. Even in violence, he was precise, never emotional. He had mastered the art of detachment, and in a life where emotion could get you killed, that mastery made him untouchable. As the city's drug trade grew, Silk's world expanded. He began meeting people from different crews, forming quiet alliances. He wasn't the one selling, but the one ensuring operations ran smoothly. If someone broke a rule, Silk handled it discreetly. The streets had a strange kind of respect for that. Violence was expected, but chaos was not. And Silk was order in human form. Yet this rise didn't come without cost. The more his name circulated, the more attention he attracted from both rivals and law enforcement. But Silk knew how to stay in the gray, never visible enough to draw heat, never distant enough to lose relevance. He played the long game, and he played it flawlessly. Behind the legend, though, was a man shaped by his environment. Growing up in a world that offered little mercy, Silk had built his calm out of necessity. It was armor, a way to control fear before it controlled him. Every soft-spoken sentence, every unflinching stare was part of that armor. It wasn't that he didn't feel things, he just learned to feel them quietly. People often mistook that silence for emptiness, but in truth, it was calculation. He thought before he acted. And when he acted, there was no turning back. By the mid-1980s, his name had reached beyond his block. Stories traveled faster than facts. Some said he was untouchable, others claimed he had connections in every part of the city. The truth was simpler, Silk understood people, and people trusted him, even the ones who feared him. In a world spinning out of control, his control became a myth in itself. He was the man who never panicked, the enforcer who never spoke about business, the ghost who could walk into a room and shift the entire atmosphere without a sound. But as D.C. descended deeper into chaos, with new players entering from cities like New York, Silk's quiet power would draw the attention of someone who saw in him not just skill, but loyalty, a partner who could make an empire unstoppable. The man was Alpo Martinez. Their meeting would change everything. It would take Silk from being the calm center of D.C. stormed to the right hand of one of the most notorious drug lords in American history. The name, Silk, would no longer just belong to the streets of Washington, it would echo far beyond them. And with that expansion would come the rise of a legend, and the beginning of an inevitable fall. Before the name Wayne, Silk, Perry became synonymous with D.C.'s underworld, the city itself was already transforming into a volatile stage for what would become one of America's deadliest urban dramas. The Washington, D.C., of the early 1980s was not just the capital of the United States, it was a city divided in two. On one side stood marble monuments and government buildings gleaming under the watchful eyes of politicians and tourists. On the other side, separated by invisible boundaries of class and race, entire neighborhoods were being consumed by addiction, violence, and despair. This was a city of power and poverty, control and chaos, and at the heart of it all, the streets were rewriting their own laws. In those years, the crack cocaine epidemic didn't arrive all at once, it crept in slowly, quietly, like a sickness that no one saw until it was too late. At first, the hustle was small. Young dealers stood on corners selling weed, powder cocaine, or pills. But when crack hit, everything changed overnight. It was faster, cheaper, and far more addictive. What began as a small-time street hustle turned into a billion-dollar underground economy. The money was fast, the respect immediate, and the danger constant. For every corner controlled, someone was willing to die, or kill, for it. And while the politicians held press conferences about cleaning up the streets, the reality was that the streets had already cleaned themselves, violently and efficiently. By the mid-1980s, D.C. had earned a grim nickname, the murder capital. There were entire neighborhoods that the police avoided after dark. Sirens became part of the city's rhythm, blending with the hum of streetlights and the chatter of payphones. For many who lived there, fear was normal. You learned to recognize the sound of gunfire, to drop instinctively when it came too close. Children played basketball beside memorial murals of friends who'd never made it to adulthood. This was the world that raised Silk Perry, a place where survival depended not on what you had, but on what you understood. Within this environment, Silk was no longer just an observer. He had grown into a man who understood how the streets operated, how power was maintained, and how fear could be controlled. He wasn't a dealer, he was something rarer, a man who could make order in a world without rules. Crews began to notice him. He had connections in almost every ward of the city, and he was respected for one thing above all, reliability. If Silk gave his word, it was kept. If he said he'd handle something, it was done, quietly and completely. In a world where trust was currency, that made him invaluable. The structure of the underworld in D.C. wasn't like New York or Chicago, where organized crime families held territory for decades. D.C.'s version was younger, more chaotic, a patchwork of crews and cliques that rose and fell with the flow of money. Many of these groups operated like small armies, led by charismatic figures who ruled through intimidation and cash. But unlike those who relied on flash and bravado, Silk operated in shadows. He had learned that real power didn't need an audience. While others flaunted jewelry and cars, he stayed understated, blending into the very city he controlled from behind the scenes. The drug trade was not just a business, it was a war, and like all wars, it had its generals, its soldiers, and its casualties. Federal agencies began to take notice of how organized D.C.'s street economy had become. DEA agents mapped territories, identifying who ran which blocks. The names of men like Raphael Edmond, Tony Lewis, and others became legends, symbols of both success and destruction. In this ecosystem, Silk was not yet the biggest player, but he was fast becoming the most respected enforcer. He had ties that stretched across crews and understood that violence, when used sparingly and strategically, could maintain stability better than chaos. He wasn't reckless, he was surgical. Despite the brutality around him, Silk carried a quiet philosophy. He believed that even in the street world, there was a kind of honor, a structure to the madness. Deals should be respected, promises kept, and betrayal dealt with swiftly. This moral code, twisted though it might seem, gave him a sense of purpose. He didn't kill for pleasure or profit, but for order. In his mind, he was maintaining balance in a city that had lost its center. It was this code that made him dangerous, not just to rivals, but to anyone who underestimated how deeply he believed in it. Meanwhile, D.C.'s political leaders faced their own unraveling. Mayor Marion Barry's administration was plagued by scandal, corruption, and the same drugs that fueled the street wars. The gap between the city's political elite and its suffering neighborhoods widened by the day. For the young and ambitious on the streets, the system offered no path upward. The only hierarchy that mattered was built with money and fear. This was the world Silk navigated with precision. While others were being gunned down or locked up, he continued to rise quietly, his influence growing even as the city burned around him. It was during this period that outsiders began to notice the power vacuum in D.C.'s underworld. Harlem hustlers, seeing opportunity in the chaos, started extending their operations south. They came with flashier cars, better product, and a willingness to take risks local crews avoided. Among them was a man who would soon reshape the city's criminal landscape, Alpo Martinez. Young, charismatic, and fearless, Alpo embodied everything Silk wasn't: loud, impulsive, and hungry for attention. Yet their paths were destined to cross. And when they did, D.C.'s underworld would change forever. As the 1980s drew deeper into darkness, Silk could feel the tension building. The old ways of doing business, handshakes, quiet respect, mutual understanding, were being replaced by greed and ego. The streets were becoming unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. But Silk remained steady, his calm a kind of anchor in the madness. People trusted him because he never broke his word. Even the police knew his name, but they knew little else. He was a mystery, and mysteries are hard to catch. The city was teetering on the edge, and somewhere within that chaos, fate was preparing its introduction. The enforcer who had learned to move silently through D.C.'s shadows was about to meet the man who would pull him into a storm larger than anything he had faced before. The streets of Washington had built Silk Perry, teaching him patience, precision, and loyalty. But the arrival of Alpo Martinez would test all three, and reveal just how far loyalty could stretch before it finally broke. The meeting between Wayne, Silk Perry and Alpo Martinez was not one of fate or luck, it was the inevitable collision of two very different men chasing the same thing: power. One was the silent guardian of Washington, D.C.'s streets, the other a flamboyant kingpin from Harlem who believed fear was best served with flash. In a world where alliances shifted daily and loyalty was rare, their partnership would become one of legend, a bond that built an empire and, eventually, destroyed it. But when they first crossed paths, neither man could have imagined how deeply their fates would intertwine. The story begins in the mid-1980s, when Alpo Martinez was expanding his drug operation from New York into the nation's capital. He had already made a name for himself uptown, young, charismatic, and bold enough to challenge the old guard of Harlem hustlers. His reputation preceded him: fast cars, expensive clothes, gold chains that caught the light of every street lamp. To some, he was magnetic. To others, reckless. But Alpo had vision, and that vision led him to D.C., a city ripe for takeover. He knew the local crews were disorganized, fighting each other instead of uniting. All he needed was someone who could command respect in a city where outsiders were rarely welcomed. That man, everyone told him, was Wayne "Silk" Perry. At first, Silk didn't care much for outsiders. D.C. had its own rhythm, its own code, and New Yorkers often came in thinking they could rewrite the rules. But when Silk finally met Alpo, likely through mutual connections who saw opportunity in their union, something unexpected happened. He saw in Alpo a reflection of what he once admired: confidence without hesitation, ambition without fear. Alpo, in turn, saw in Silk what he lacked, a steady hand, discipline, and a presence that commanded obedience without noise. Their chemistry was immediate, like fire meeting oxygen. Together, they could control the city. Alpo would bring the product, and Silk would make sure no one interfered. Their first meeting was quiet but electric. Alpo, dressed in designer clothes and carrying the charm of a man who'd never doubted himself, spoke quickly and confidently about his plans. Silk listened more than he spoke, his expression unreadable. When he finally did respond, his voice was calm, measured, almost soothing. He told Alpo that D.C. wasn't New York, that here, fear traveled faster than fame, and respect couldn't be bought with money alone. Alpo smiled at that, he admired it. He saw in Silk not just muscle, but a kind of wisdom that only came from years of surviving the unpredictable rhythm of the streets. That night, a partnership was born, one built on charisma and control, chaos and calm. Over the next few months, their bond deepened. Alpo began to trust Silk like few others. He relied on him for protection, advice, and, most importantly, enforcement. Silk became the gatekeeper between Alpo and D.C.'s violent underbelly. Every problem, every dispute, every threat, Silk handled it. The results were always the same, quick, decisive, final. Alpo's empire in the capital began to flourish under Silk's silent supervision. While Alpo moved like a star, Silk moved like a shadow, always there, never loud, but felt in every decision. Together, they ruled D.C. in a way few duos ever had, one with flash and one with focus. Their dynamic was fascinating to those who watched it unfold. Alpo was unpredictable, a storm that drew attention everywhere he went. He loved the spotlight, the roaring engines of imported cars, the feel of fine leather, the admiration of crowds. Silk was the opposite, private, patient, and observant. Where Alpo sought glory, Silk sought control. It was this balance that made them unstoppable, at least for a time. Alpo brought expansion and energy, Silk brought discipline and fear. One represented the future of the game, the other its foundation. Under Silk's guidance, Alpo's D.C. operation became one of the most efficient and feared drug networks on the East Coast. Money flowed through the streets like water, and violence, though present, was controlled. Silk had rules, no unnecessary bloodshed, no chaos that drew police attention, and no disrespect. Those who broke the code paid for it quickly. Yet, even as they built this empire, there were cracks forming beneath the surface. Alpo's hunger for power often clashed with Silk's need for order. The more Alpo flaunted his success, the more attention they drew, from rivals, from envious allies, and from federal agents who were already tracking his movements across state lines. To the outside world, though, their partnership looked unbreakable. They moved through the city like royalty, Alpo laughing loudly at club tables surrounded by women and money, Silk standing nearby, watchful and still. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but everyone in the room knew who he was. You didn't disrespect Silk. You didn't even look him in the eye unless he allowed it. Where Alpo's energy drew people in, Silk's presence kept them in check. The balance between the two was like music, the rhythm of chaos and calm in perfect sync. But deep inside, Silk understood something Alpo didn't: power comes with expiration dates. He had seen it before, young men rising fast, burning bright, then falling just as quickly. The streets always collected their debts, no matter how high you climbed. Silk wasn't naive, he knew their run couldn't last forever. Yet, his loyalty ran deep. To him, Alpo wasn't just a business partner, he was a friend, a brother in arms. That loyalty would later become his curse. Even during their golden days, there were moments when Silk's instincts told him trouble was coming. Alpo's reckless nature made enemies, and not the kind you could ignore. Rumors began to swirl that rival crews were watching, waiting. The feds, too, were growing curious about the sudden flood of drugs and money in D.C. But for now, the empire stood strong. Silk's discipline and Alpo's daring made them untouchable, or so it seemed. There's an image often remembered from those years, Alpo standing on a crowded street, laughing with his crew, while Silk stands a few steps away, hands in his pockets, expression calm but unreadable. Two men, opposite in every way, yet bound by the same pursuit of control. It was a snapshot of balance, of empire. But beneath that still image was motion, a slow, quiet shift toward betrayal, paranoia, and downfall. For now, though, the city belonged to them. Washington, D.C., had never seen anything like it, the Harlem Star and the D.C. enforcer, together rewriting the rules of the game. Every move they made echoed through the neighborhoods, through whispered conversations, through glances exchanged in silence. The streets respected them, feared them, and, in some strange way, admired them. What neither man could know was that this partnership, so powerful, so perfectly matched, was also the beginning of the end. For in every legend of power and loyalty, there comes a moment when trust begins to rot from the inside. For Wayne, Silk, Perry and Alpo Martinez, that moment was approaching fast, hidden beneath the glitter of success and the hum of the city's restless nights. The empire that Wayne, Silk, Perry and Alpo Martinez built together was as dazzling as it was dangerous, a structure made of gold and shadows, held together by loyalty, fear, and the fragile illusion of control. By the late 1980s, their reach in Washington, D.C., had stretched far beyond a few neighborhoods. From the southeast corridors to uptown corners, the name Alpo carried the weight of power, and the presence of Silk made that power untouchable. Together, they had achieved what few in the drug world ever did, stability. But beneath that calm surface, pressure was building, and Silk, ever observant, could already feel the tension tightening around them like a noose. Money was pouring in faster than anyone could count. Every night, cars with tinted windows rolled through D.C.'s dimly lit streets, collecting cash and dropping off product. Alpo's cocaine was pure and consistent, and Silk's reputation for handling problems with precision kept the competition at bay. They had lieutenants managing street-level dealers, runners carrying messages, and lookouts stationed at every crucial corner. It was an operation that ran like a machine, efficient, controlled, and terrifyingly effective. But the more money they made, the more noise surrounded them. And in the underworld, noise is death. Silk had always been a man of silence. He believed that the less people knew, the safer you were. He rarely talked on phones, never boasted, and kept his circle painfully small. Alpo, on the other hand, was addicted to attention. He loved the way people looked at him when he pulled up in a brand new car, the way his name echoed in conversations across both Harlem and D.C. He was young, rich, and fearless. But in the world they lived in, that combination wasn't a gift, it was a target. Silk tried to warn him. "The more they see you," he said quietly one night, "the more they'll aim for you." Alpo laughed, waving him off. "Let 'em aim," he said. "They can't hit what's blessed." Silk didn't argue. He rarely did. But inside, he was uneasy. He had spent years watching men like Alpo rise and fall, men who thought they were untouchable, only to vanish in a hail of bullets or a courtroom verdict. Still, his loyalty held firm. Alpo had never betrayed him, and Silk's code demanded that he return that trust, no matter how dangerous it became. And so, as Alpo's empire grew louder, Silk worked harder in the shadows, cleaning up messes, resolving conflicts, and ensuring that Alpo's name continued to shine without blood splattering its reflection. There were rules to their world, unwritten laws that every serious player understood. One of them was respect. You didn't cross those who kept order, and you didn't break trust with the people who protected you. Another was silence. What happened in the streets stayed there. But Alpo's rise was beginning to challenge both. He was starting to trust too many people, talk too freely, and spend too publicly. Flashing stacks of money and expensive jewelry might win admiration from the streets, but it also attracted the eyes of enemies and agents alike. Federal investigators were already building quiet cases against major D.C. figures, and Alpo's name was starting to surface in whispers and reports. Meanwhile, the city itself was shifting. The crack epidemic had reached its peak, flooding every corner of D.C. with chaos. Murders spiked, bodies appeared in alleyways, and entire blocks were being lost to addiction. For the police and DEA, the streets were a war zone. For men like Silk, it was just another day at work. But even he could sense that the violence was changing. It was no longer strategic, no longer disciplined. Young dealers with no code were taking over corners, starting wars over ego instead of business. The order Silk had once maintained was dissolving. It was during this period that Silk's reputation as an enforcer became almost mythical. People said his name in hushed tones, the way soldiers might speak of a ghost on the battlefield. Stories circulated, some true, some exaggerated, about the precision with which he handled threats. A man who crossed Alpo once was found a week later, silent forever. Another who had stolen money from the organization was said to have disappeared without a trace. Silk never confirmed or denied anything. He didn't need to. Fear did the talking for him. His mere presence in a room could end an argument, settle a dispute, or stop a betrayal before it began. But Silk was not just a killer, he was a thinker. He saw beyond the violence, understanding the psychology of control. He knew when to act and when to wait. He could read a man's eyes and tell if he was lying, could sense danger before it arrived. Alpo depended on this intuition. It was Silk's calm that allowed Alpo to move recklessly, knowing someone always had his back. Yet, that same calm hid a growing concern, a realization that the empire they built was starting to attract too much attention. The higher you climbed, Silk often thought, the thinner the air became. Their relationship, once built on mutual respect, was slowly changing. Alpo began to make decisions without consulting Silk. He took risks that made no sense, expanded too quickly, and trusted people who hadn't earned it. Silk tried to warn him again, but Alpo's confidence had turned into arrogance. "We run this city," he told Silk one night, grinning. "Ain't nobody touching us." Silk looked at him for a long moment before replying softly, "Everybody gets touched eventually." It wasn't a threat, it was a truth. But Alpo didn't hear it that way. Despite his doubts, Silk remained loyal. He continued to protect Alpo, even when he disagreed with his choices. Their bond had been built in blood, and for Silk, loyalty was sacred. Yet, the more he protected Alpo, the more isolated he became. Old friends began to distance themselves, afraid that being too close to Silk could make them targets. Even within Alpo's own crew, jealousy began to grow. Some whispered that Silk had too much influence, that Alpo was relying on him too heavily. It was the kind of talk that bred paranoia, and paranoia was poison. Still, for a while, everything continued to function. The money kept flowing, the power kept growing, and D.C. remained under their quiet control. But something unseen was already at work, a slow unraveling of trust, an invisible crack running through the foundation of everything they had built. The streets that once feared and respected them were changing, becoming unpredictable. Rivals were regrouping. Law enforcement was closing in. And in the midst of all this, Silk began to sense what Alpo could not, that they were standing at the top of a mountain that had nowhere left to climb. The empire they had built together, one forged in loyalty, fear, and ambition, was beginning to tremble under its own weight. In quiet moments, when the city finally slept and the streets grew still, Silk would think about the path he'd taken, the deals, the deaths, the long nights of waiting for the next move. He wondered if there was still a way out, a way to slow the fall he knew was coming. But deep down, he also knew something else: once you reach a certain level in this life, there's no going back. The only question left was not if the empire would fall, but how and when. And though Silk couldn't yet see it, the answer to both questions was already moving toward them, silent and certain, just as he had always been. By the early 1990s, the partnership between Wayne, Silk, Perry and Alpo Martinez had transformed into a living legend on the streets of Washington, D.C. They were no longer just names whispered in alleyways or in the corners of dimly lit clubs, they had become symbols of an era. Alpo represented the untouchable glamour of the drug trade, fast cars, expensive fashion, a fearless attitude that made him a magnet for envy and admiration alike. Silk, on the other hand, embodied its discipline and danger, the cold precision that kept that empire alive. Together, they were unstoppable. But what no one realized then, not even them, was that their greatest danger wasn't from the streets, but from each other. The empire was at its peak. Alpo's connections to New York ensured a steady supply of product, while Silk's control over D.C.'s streets made sure that product moved efficiently. Money came in by the thousands daily, sometimes packed in duffel bags, sometimes counted by hand in rooms thick with the smell of cocaine and cigarette smoke. There were nights when they made more in a few hours than most people would see in a lifetime. But as the profits grew, so did the problems. Envy, greed, and paranoia, those invisible predators, had started circling the empire, feeding on success. It began subtly, as these things always do. Small disputes over territory. Rumors that certain lieutenants were skimming money. Whispers that Alpo was too flashy, too careless, that he was attracting heat from law enforcement. And then, more dangerous whispers still, that someone inside the circle was feeding information to the police. In the underworld, even a rumor like that could ignite a war. Silk, who had built his life on loyalty and silence, took those rumors seriously. He began watching everyone more closely, studying faces, movements, conversations. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make his suspicion known. But Alpo didn't want to hear it. He brushed off Silk's concerns as paranoia. "We good," he'd say, smiling through clouds of cigar smoke, gold chains glinting in the light. "Ain't nobody touching us. You worry too much." To Alpo, the idea of betrayal was distant, almost impossible. But to Silk, who understood human nature like few others did, betrayal was not a possibility, it was inevitable. He'd seen it too many times before. He knew that fear and greed made people do desperate things, and that the higher you climbed, the more people wanted to pull you down. Their relationship began to shift. Alpo's growing arrogance created a quiet divide between them. He started making decisions without consulting Silk, trusting new faces who hadn't earned their place. He began surrounding himself with yes men, people who told him what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to know. To a man like Silk, who valued loyalty above all else, this was a red flag. He saw it as weakness, and weakness, in their world, was death waiting to happen. Silk's instincts were rarely wrong. The empire was beginning to attract serious attention from federal authorities. The DEA, FBI, and local police had started coordinating efforts to dismantle D.C.'s drug networks. Surveillance operations were underway. Informants were being planted. Wiretaps were recording late-night conversations. Alpo's flashy lifestyle and open defiance of the law made him an easy target. Silk tried to warn him, urging him to move more quietly, to scale back, to disappear for a while. But Alpo's ego had grown too large. "You think they can touch me?" he laughed one night, tossing a stack of cash onto the table. "I'm Alpo. I'm untouchable." Silk said nothing, but inside, he knew that no one was untouchable. Everyone had a weakness, a breaking point, and Alpo's was his pride. The more Silk tried to steady the ship, the more Alpo steered it toward danger. Their once unbreakable bond was being tested, stretched thin by pressure and paranoia. And when loyalty starts to crack in a world built on fear, the results are never clean. Tension within the crew began to rise. People were whispering about missed payments, missing product, and favoritism. Some began to fear Silk, believing he held too much influence. Others resented Alpo, claiming he cared more about fame than business. Silk found himself in a strange position, both the most trusted and most feared man in the operation. He tried to maintain order, using his reputation to silence dissent, but the loyalty that once held their network together was now splintering. There was one incident that marked a turning point, a moment that would later echo in the memories of those who had been close to them. A small-time dealer, known to both Alpo and Silk, was suspected of stealing money. It was a minor offense, one that could have been solved quietly. But Alpo, impulsive and eager to send a message, decided to make an example out of him. Silk tried to intervene, suggesting a quieter resolution. Alpo ignored him. The dealer was killed publicly, a reckless move that sent shockwaves through the city and caught the attention of law enforcement. That act changed everything. Silk saw it as unnecessary, a break from their usual precision. It was sloppy, loud, and emotional, everything Silk despised. It was also the first time he felt that Alpo was losing control. He didn't say it out loud, but in his heart, he knew, the man who had once been his equal was now becoming a liability. Despite the growing tension, Silk remained loyal. He had built his life on principles of honor, and abandoning Alpo wasn't something he could do easily. But the weight of the empire, the violence, the greed, the constant threat of betrayal, was beginning to take its toll on him. There were nights when he sat in silence, cigarette smoke curling through the air, thinking about the choices that had brought him here. The streets had given him everything, money, respect, fear, but they had also taken everything that mattered, peace, trust, and freedom. And then came the first real sign that the empire's end was near. Federal investigators, having tracked Alpo's movements between New York and D.C., began tightening their net. They flipped several low-level dealers, gaining inside information about supply lines and hierarchy. They learned about Silk, about his reputation, his precision, his code. His name was mentioned often in whispers, always with the same mix of fear and respect. Law enforcement didn't know exactly who he was, but they knew that behind every violent decision, every strategic move, there was one steady hand guiding it, Wayne "Silk" Perry. Alpo didn't take it seriously. Silk did. He could feel the air changing. The streets, once alive with opportunity, now hummed with tension. Every glance felt like a test. Every handshake carried risk. The same fear that had once worked in their favor was now closing in on them. In those final golden days of their empire, Silk and Alpo were like two stars burning too close to each other, brilliant, powerful, but doomed to collide. Their friendship had been built on trust and loyalty, but now it was bending under the weight of ego, greed, and paranoia. And somewhere deep inside, Silk knew the truth: all empires, no matter how mighty, eventually fall. Theirs would be no different. But unlike most, their downfall wouldn't come from rivals or bullets in the street. It would come from something far more dangerous, something Silk had always feared and always expected. It would come from within. By the early 1990s, the world that Wayne, Silk, Perry and Alpo Martinez had built together began to fracture, slowly at first, then all at once. The glow of their success still shimmered across Washington, D.C., but beneath that brilliance was something darker, something fragile. Power, once their greatest weapon, was turning against them. And though the streets still whispered their names, with awe and fear, those same whispers had begun to change tone. Respect was giving way to suspicion, admiration to envy, loyalty to quiet betrayal. For Silk, the signs were everywhere. He could feel the shift in the air, a kind of tension that never went away. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Eyes lingered too long. People who used to greet him with confidence now averted their gaze. He'd seen this before, he knew what it meant. Power bred fear, and fear bred treachery. Still, he stayed loyal to Alpo, even as cracks began to show in the foundation of their empire. But loyalty, Silk would soon learn, is not always returned. It was around this time that Alpo's paranoia began to bloom into full-blown distrust. Once charming and charismatic, he became short-tempered and erratic. He accused friends of betrayal, questioned longtime associates, and began isolating himself from anyone who didn't agree with him. The weight of his empire, and the heat from law enforcement, was starting to break him. His world, once defined by control and confidence, was now being poisoned by fear. Silk noticed the change immediately. He'd always been Alpo's anchor, the calm to his chaos, but now even his presence couldn't ground him. Alpo had begun to see enemies everywhere. In meetings that once flowed easily, he now sat in silence, eyes darting, hand on his pistol. He stopped trusting his inner circle and started moving with fewer people. His conversations became cryptic, his plans impulsive. Silk tried to talk to him, to calm him down, to remind him of the code they'd built everything on: respect, loyalty, discipline. But Alpo wasn't listening anymore. The same confidence that had once built their empire was now tearing it apart. The tension reached a new level when rumors started spreading that one of their closest associates, a man Alpo had made millions with, was cooperating with the police. It was a rumor, nothing more, but in their world, a rumor could get you killed. Alpo was convinced it was true. He started talking about making an example, about cleaning house. Silk, who had always believed in precision over emotion, tried to slow him down. "We don't move on whispers," he told Alpo quietly one night. "We move on proof." But Alpo wasn't looking for proof anymore. He was looking for control, and fear was his new weapon. That night, something changed between them. For years, Silk had been the steady hand behind Alpo's empire, the man who handled problems with discipline and silence. But now, Alpo didn't want silence, he wanted chaos. The trust that had defined their partnership was fading fast, replaced by suspicion and ego. And in a world where one wrong move could mean death, that loss of trust was deadly. It wasn't long before Alpo's paranoia turned violent. He began ordering hits without consulting Silk. Old allies disappeared. Friends turned into ghosts. The once stable empire was descending into bloodshed. Every killing drew more attention from law enforcement, more whispers on the streets, more tension within their ranks. And through it all, Silk remained calm, watching, calculating, silently trying to manage the unmanageable. He still protected Alpo. Even when he disagreed with his choices, he stood by him. It wasn't weakness, it was principle. To Silk, loyalty wasn't conditional. You didn't stand with someone only when it was easy. You stood with them when the world turned against them. That was his code. But as Alpo spiraled deeper into paranoia, that loyalty began to feel more like a chain than a creed. The federal heat was now undeniable. Surveillance units tracked Alpo's cars. Wiretaps picked up fragments of coded conversations. Anonymous tips poured in. The empire had become too big, too visible, and too violent to hide. Silk knew the walls were closing in, but Alpo refused to see it. He still believed he could outsmart the system, that his charm and audacity could carry him through. But Silk had lived long enough to know that charm meant nothing when the feds came knocking. One evening, after a tense meeting where Alpo accused yet another associate of betrayal, Silk finally spoke his mind. His voice was calm, measured, but heavy with meaning. "You can't keep killing everyone you don't trust," he said. "Soon there'll be no one left." Alpo didn't respond at first. He just stared at him, eyes hard, jaw tight. Then he said quietly, "You sound like them, Silk." That moment hung in the air like a blade. For the first time, Silk realized that Alpo's paranoia might not stop with others, it might eventually turn on him. The thought cut deep, not because he feared Alpo, but because he cared for him. They had built something together, something that once felt unbreakable. But now, that empire was becoming a prison made of fear and betrayal. As the weeks passed, the divide between them grew. Silk moved more carefully, avoiding unnecessary contact with anyone outside their tight circle. He noticed unfamiliar cars trailing behind his own, unfamiliar faces watching from corners. Whether they were feds, rivals, or Alpo's new enforcers, he couldn't be sure. What he did know was that the days of control were over. The empire they had once ruled with confidence was now running on instinct, fueled by paranoia and desperation. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, Silk stayed composed. Even as Alpo unraveled, Silk remained a man of silence and principle. His calmness unnerved people, it always had. But now, it also made him a target. In Alpo's mind, anyone that calm had to be hiding something. It was ironic, in a way. The man who had once been Alpo's greatest protector was now becoming, in his paranoia, the man he feared most. The same loyalty that had kept Silk by his side was now being twisted into suspicion. The streets, as always, whispered their own version of the story, that Silk was tired of being the shadow, that he wanted his own empire, that maybe he was the one feeding the feds. Lies spread faster than truth, and in the world they lived in, lies killed faster than bullets. Silk could feel it coming, the inevitable breaking point. He didn't know when or how, but he knew that the storm was about to hit. Every empire, he often said, falls not from outside attack but from internal collapse. And theirs was already crumbling. What made it all so tragic was that, deep down, Silk never stopped caring for Alpo. Even as he watched his friend lose himself to greed and fear, some part of him still hoped it could be fixed, that the man he once respected might find his way back. But the streets don't forgive weakness, and they don't grant redemption. Soon, their story would shift from legend to tragedy, from partnership to betrayal. The same loyalty that once made Silk untouchable would soon become his greatest vulnerability. And though neither man knew it yet, the choices they were making in those restless D.C. nights were leading them toward a reckoning that would define both their legacies forever. For now, though, the empire still stood, glittering on the outside, hollow within. The streets were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. And when that storm finally broke, it would not be merciful. The calm before the storm in Washington, D.C. was deceptive. On the surface, Wayne, Silk, Perry and Alpo Martinez still appeared to be in control, two kings reigning over a kingdom built on respect, money, and fear. The streets still whispered their names with reverence. The cars still lined up late at night, headlights dimmed, deals conducted with a smooth efficiency that only years of dominance could produce. But beneath that quiet rhythm, something was unraveling. The bond that had once made them unstoppable was beginning to crack, not with a loud explosion, but with a slow, poisonous drip of paranoia and pride. Silk had always known that power came with a price. He had seen it destroy stronger men than Alpo, men who believed they were immune to consequence, men who forgot that fear and respect were not the same thing. Alpo, once sharp and instinctive, had become reckless. He flaunted his wealth in clubs, drew attention from law enforcement, and bragged openly about their operations. What had once been an empire of shadows was now bathed in unwanted light. Silk, ever the strategist, tried to keep their movements quiet, to restore the discipline that had kept them alive this long. But every attempt to bring order seemed to make Alpo more defensive. "You worry too much," Alpo would say with a smirk, brushing off Silk's warnings. "Ain't nobody catching us. We too smart, too connected." Silk would stare at him silently, his expression unreadable. He'd seen that kind of arrogance before, and it always ended the same way, in handcuffs, in blood, or both. Yet, despite his growing concern, he stayed loyal. Because to Silk, loyalty was not optional, it was sacred. He'd built his reputation on that principle, and even now, as Alpo drifted further from reason, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. The atmosphere within the organization was changing. The crew, once united by purpose, now operated on fear and self-preservation. Whispers of betrayal circulated constantly. Names were tossed around, this one was talking too much, that one was getting greedy, someone else was cutting corners. The tension was suffocating. Even the younger dealers who once idolized Alpo began to sense that something was off. The man who used to inspire confidence now instilled unease. It was around this time that the name Rico started to surface, Rich Porter's former associate, an old connection from Harlem whose loyalty had been questioned after a series of missing shipments and strange disappearances. To Alpo, the very idea of betrayal from someone close was intolerable. To Silk, it was predictable. Betrayal wasn't rare in their world, it was part of the rhythm. But Alpo's response was extreme. He was no longer thinking like a businessman, he was thinking like a man under siege. The paranoia that had been simmering inside Alpo boiled over one cold night. He called Silk, his tone sharp, urgent. "We got a problem," he said. "I think Rico's been talking." Silk paused. "You got proof?" "I don't need proof," Alpo replied. "I just know." Silk took a deep breath. "You can't move on feelings, puh. Feelings get you caught. Let me handle it." But Alpo was already past the point of reason. He wanted blood, not logic. And this was where their worlds began to diverge completely. Silk had always believed in balance, that violence should serve purpose, not emotion. Alpo, driven by fear and ego, was about to break that rule in a way that would change everything. That night, Silk stood by silently as Alpo's paranoia turned into irreversible action. They met Rico under the guise of conversation, a chance to clear things up. But Silk could feel it in the air, the stillness, the tension, the faint metallic taste of betrayal. Alpo was not there to talk. He was there to eliminate what he perceived as a threat. And though Silk didn't agree with it, his code of loyalty demanded that he stand beside Alpo, even in disagreement. The moment was quick, brutal, and final. One gunshot in the cold, followed by another. When it was over, silence fell heavy. The kind of silence that sticks to your skin, that hums in your ears long after the sound has faded. Alpo didn't flinch. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Silk standing there, the weight of what they had done pressing against his chest like a stone. That was the night everything changed. Silk knew, deep in his bones, that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Killing out of necessity was one thing, killing out of fear was another. That act marked the beginning of their downfall, not because of law enforcement, not because of rival crews, but because something inside them had shifted. Silk, for the first time, began to see Alpo not as a brother, but as a man spiraling toward destruction. In the days that followed, Alpo's behavior became increasingly erratic. He tried to act normal, throwing parties, laughing loudly, pretending that nothing had changed. But everyone could feel it, the tension, the unease. The crew whispered about Rico's disappearance. People started distancing themselves, afraid that they might be next. The empire that once thrived on loyalty was now feeding on fear. Meanwhile, Silk found himself haunted. He didn't show it, he never did, but the images replayed in his mind. He had lived a life where death was a familiar companion, but this one was different. It wasn't business, it was betrayal dressed as survival. And deep down, he knew that once betrayal entered the bloodstream of an empire, it spread like poison until nothing pure remained. Law enforcement took notice too. Rico's disappearance sparked renewed interest in Alpo's operation. Federal investigators began connecting dots, tracing phone calls, following money trails, piecing together the hierarchy of D.C.'s drug trade. Silk's name surfaced more frequently in reports, always described the same way: enforcer, fixer, dangerous. They didn't yet know how deep his loyalty ran, how much influence he truly had, or how disciplined he was. But they were watching. And Alpo, blinded by his own paranoia, didn't notice that the real threat wasn't coming from the streets, it was coming from the agencies quietly circling above. Silk did. He could feel the pressure building from every direction. The streets were unstable. The crew was divided. The feds were getting closer. Every instinct told him to fall back, to disappear, to let the empire crumble on its own. But he stayed, still holding to his code, still protecting the man who was no longer protecting himself. There's a certain tragedy in loyalty, the way it can become a kind of imprisonment. Silk understood that now. His word was his bond, and that bond was leading him straight into the storm. But he accepted it. To him, betrayal was worse than death, and walking away from Alpo would have felt like betrayal. Still, something inside him was changing. The quiet pride that had once come from being the invisible force behind D.C.'s most feared empire was fading. In its place was something colder, disillusionment, exhaustion, the creeping realization that the empire he had helped build was built on sand. The night after Rico's death, Silk stood alone, looking out over the city that had made him who he was. The lights flickered in the distance, the streets below alive with movement. He thought about how far he had come from the boy who grew up in D.C.'s projects, chasing survival. And he wondered if, somewhere along the way, he had mistaken fear for respect, and violence for control. In the distance, a siren wailed, faint at first, then growing louder. It echoed through the night like a warning, like a prophecy. Silk turned away from the window, his face calm, his thoughts quiet. He knew what was coming. He always did. The only question now was not whether the storm would hit, but who would survive when it did. And for the first time in years, Wayne, Silk, Perry began to wonder if loyalty, his greatest strength, might also be the thing that finally destroyed him. By the time the year turned, the city of Washington, D.C., had changed. It wasn't just the landscape or the people, it was the air itself. The tension that had once hummed quietly beneath the surface now pulsed openly through the streets. The empire that Wayne, Silk, Perry and Alpo Martinez had built, brick by brick, body by body, was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every whisper carried a warning. And at the center of it all stood two men who had once trusted each other with their lives, now divided by suspicion, pride, and the inevitable gravity of betrayal. The killing of Rico had sent ripples through every corner of the underworld. It wasn't just another murder, it was a message, one that screamed instability. Cruz, who had once done business with Alpo, began pulling away, afraid that his paranoia might turn on them next. The supply lines grew thinner, the money slower. Whispers of federal investigations began to circulate, and for the first time, even the streets themselves seemed to sense that the reign of Alpo and Silk was nearing its end. Silk could feel it in his bones. He had been through storms before, but this one was different. This wasn't about rival crews or territory. This was about consequence, years of violence, pride, and recklessness catching up to them. He had built his life around a strict code of loyalty and control, but both were slipping away. And no matter how calm he appeared on the outside, deep down, he knew the walls were closing in. He spent most nights in silence now, sitting in dimly lit rooms with the curtains drawn, thinking about how it had all come to this. The empire that had once run like a machine was now a ghost of itself. Dealers were vanishing, money was being seized, and the kind of loyalty that had once bound their world together was crumbling under the pressure of fear. Every man was for himself, and even those who swore allegiance to Alpo were quietly making plans for their own survival. Alpo, on the other hand, refused to see the truth. He was still trying to live as if nothing had changed, flashing money, driving the same cars, attending parties as if the world wasn't watching him burn. But Silk saw what others couldn't. Behind that familiar grin, behind the expensive clothes and loud laughter, Alpo was unraveling. His eyes had lost their sharpness. His words carried an edge of desperation. He had become a man running from his own reflection. There were moments when Silk tried to reach him. He would speak softly, reminding him of the discipline that had once defined their rise, the patience, the strategy, the silence. But Alpo had changed. "You don't get it, Silk," he snapped one night. "They watching me. They watching all of us. I can feel it. Silk's voice stayed calm. Then fall back. Move quiet. Alpo laughed bitterly. It's too late for that. And perhaps he was right. The feds were watching. For months, surveillance teams had been documenting Alpo's movements, tracking his connections, recording phone calls, and collecting enough evidence to bring down the empire from the inside out. The walls weren't just closing in, they were tightening. Informants began to surface, men who had once sworn they would die before talking were now whispering to save themselves. Silk, ever cautious, began to sense the invisible eyes around them. He adjusted his patterns, changed cars, rotated safe houses, minimized contact. He knew what was coming, and he was preparing for it in his own quiet way. But there was only so much even he could do when his closest ally refused to listen. It was late one night when Silk's suspicions turned into certainty. They were driving through D.C., the streets slick from rain, when a convoy of unmarked cars appeared in the rearview mirror. Not close enough to strike, but close enough to follow. Silk didn't panic. He simply glanced at Alpo and said, "You see that?" Alpo didn't answer at first. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Yeah," he finally muttered. "I see it." Neither spoke for the rest of the drive. They both knew what it meant. From that night on, Silk moved differently. He started withdrawing from the business, distancing himself from the everyday dealings that had once kept their empire alive. He focused on silence, on minimizing exposure, reducing risk. But Alpo couldn't stop. He was too deep in it, too used to the rush, too afraid of becoming irrelevant. And so, as Silk tried to retreat into the shadows, Alpo stepped further into the light. Their paths, once parallel, were now diverging completely. For Silk, the nights grew longer, quieter, heavier. He began to think more about what it all meant, the years spent chasing respect, the friends lost along the way, the blood spilled. In the name of loyalty. He thought about his mother, about the streets that had raised him, about how easily the line between survival and destruction could blur. Somewhere along the way, the dream of control had turned into a nightmare of chaos. He started noticing the small things, how people hesitated before answering questions, how phone lines clicked, how faces he didn't recognize started showing up in familiar places. It was as if the city itself was turning against him, every alley and doorway holding secrets he didn't want to know. But Silk never panicked. That wasn't his nature. He simply watched, waited, and thought. The moment that sealed their fate came unexpectedly. It wasn't a gunfight or an ambush, it was a phone call. A short, quiet conversation that changed everything. Silk was sitting alone when his phone rang. On the other end was a voice he recognized but hadn't heard in months, a low, cautious whisper. "They got a case, man. It's bigger than you think. They already flipped someone." Silk didn't respond right away. He just listened, his mind processing every word. The voice continued, "It's Alpo. They coming for him. And when they do, they coming for everybody around him." The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Silk sat there for a long time, the phone still in his hand. He had always known this day might come. In their world, no one stayed on top forever. But hearing it out loud, that the man he had risked everything for was now being hunted, hit him harder than he expected. He didn't panic. He didn't run. Instead, he began to prepare for the inevitable. He cleaned his weapons, burned old notes, cleared out safe houses, and went completely off the grid for a few days. But there was one thing he couldn't escape, the feeling that the end was already written. Meanwhile, Alpo was unraveling faster than ever. Rumors spread that he was looking for a way out, that he might even be considering talking to the feds to save himself. At first, Silk refused to believe it. The Alpo he knew would never snitch, would never betray the code. But deep down, he wasn't sure anymore. The man standing beside him now wasn't the same man he had met years ago. In their final meeting before everything fell apart, Silk and Alpo sat together in a dimly lit apartment. The air was thick with tension. Neither said much. Finally, Alpo broke the silence. "You think I'm losing it, don't you?" Silk looked at him steadily. "I think you already lost it." Alpo laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You always think you smarter than me." Silk's reply was simple. "No. I just think I know when something's over." That was the last time they sat together as brothers. In the days that followed, the empire finally collapsed. Arrests swept through D.C. like a wave, pulling in dealers, enforcers, suppliers, everyone even remotely connected to Alpo's operation. The news spread fast. The legend of Alpo Martinez, the Harlem king who ruled D.C., was now the headline of a federal indictment. And for the first time, the whispers in the streets were not about power, but about betrayal. Silk knew that this was only the beginning. The storm they had both seen coming had finally arrived, and it would spare no one. He had spent his life navigating the rules of the underworld, but even he couldn't control what was about to unfold. The city that had once been their empire was now their cage. The streets were silent again, but it wasn't the calm of peace, it was the quiet of aftermath, of consequence. And as the lights of D.C. flickered against the night sky, Wayne, Silk, Perry understood the truth he had avoided for too long: no matter how loyal you are, no matter how strong your code, in the end, the streets always collect their debt. The fall came not with a single explosion, but with a slow, crushing inevitability, like the final moments of a collapsing building that had been cracked for years. Washington, D.C., once the stage for Alpo Martinez and Wayne. Silk, Perry's empire, was now under siege. Helicopters thundered above neighborhoods once ruled by their word. Federal agents moved in silent formations, raiding apartments, cornering suppliers, rounding up anyone with even a whisper of connection to the organization. By the spring of 1991, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, and the Metropolitan Police Department had joined forces in an operation aimed directly at dismantling what remained of Alpo's network. They called it Operation Clean Sweep, a coordinated assault on the city's most powerful drug rings. And at the top of every chart, every board, every target list, were two names: Alpo Martinez and Wayne Perry. For months, investigators had been building their case quietly, piece by piece. Surveillance photos captured them coming and going from high-end hotels and nightclubs. Wiretaps revealed cryptic conversations. Informants provided maps of stash houses and distribution routes. Every detail was being assembled into a picture that was becoming impossible to deny. The authorities had everything they needed, except for one final piece: someone willing to testify from the inside. That's where the story of Silk and Alpo took its darkest turn. In the underworld, betrayal is considered the ultimate sin, worse than murder, worse than theft. And yet, in moments of desperation, even the strongest men have been known to bend. The walls were closing in on Alpo, and his instincts, once so sharp and sure, had turned against him. He had lost friends, money, and control. Now, cornered and facing decades behind bars, he started to consider an option that he had once sworn he never would. For Silk, the streets had always been governed by a simple rule: you stand tall or you fall silent. There were no deals with the law, no shortcuts, no compromises. He believed that a man's word, his reputation, was the only currency that truly mattered. And it was this belief that would ultimately separate him from the man he once called brother. The rumors came first, quiet, uncertain. Whispers that Alpo had been seen meeting with detectives. That he was talking. That he might be preparing to trade information for freedom. At first, Silk dismissed them. He had known Alpo for too long, had seen him face pressure before. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, spreading from cell blocks to street corners. Then, one day, a message reached Silk that froze him in place: Alpo signed the papers. He didn't want to believe it. Not because he thought Alpo was incapable, but because it meant their entire story, their bond, their code, their legacy, had been a lie. Alpo had flipped. He had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, offering detailed information on drug routes, associates, and, most painfully, Wayne "Silk" Perry himself. In exchange, the government promised a reduced sentence and entry into the witness protection program. It was a betrayal so deep, so absolute, that even the streets went quiet when the news spread. For days, Silk said nothing. Those around him described his silence as chilling. He didn't rage or rant, he didn't threaten vengeance. He simply withdrew. He had always been a man of few words, but now, even those were gone. The betrayal didn't just wound him, it hollowed him out. Because for Silk, loyalty wasn't a strategy, it was a way of life. And now, the man he had protected with his own hands, the man for whom he had spilled blood, had chosen to save himself by condemning him. As the investigation accelerated, Silk became the central target. With Alpo's testimony, prosecutors were able to connect Silk to multiple homicides, kidnappings, and acts of retaliation tied to the D.C. drug wars. The very precision and discipline that had once made him untouchable now served as evidence of his leadership in a violent criminal enterprise. Every quiet act, every efficient move, every carefully planned hit was catalogued and presented in court. Law enforcement described him as a professional in every sense of the word. He didn't kill for sport or anger, he killed for order, for business. That distinction, chilling as it was, made him one of the most dangerous men they had ever pursued. When the warrants finally came down, Silk was nowhere to be found. For weeks, he moved through the city like a ghost, staying 2 steps ahead of every raid. He changed locations constantly, slept during the day, traveled only at night. Friends offered help, but he refused most of it. He knew the feds were watching everyone. Trust had become a luxury he could no longer afford. There was one night in particular that people still talk about, the night the feds came within minutes of catching him. He was staying in a small apartment on the southeast side of D.C., alone, when he noticed the faint reflection of red and blue lights on the window. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He simply grabbed his gun, checked the back exit, and vanished into the night before they could breach the door. When the agents entered minutes later, they found the apartment empty, still warm, still smelling faintly of cigarette smoke. For the next several weeks, Silk was everywhere and nowhere. To the feds, he was a phantom, to the streets, he was a legend. Rumors said he had escaped to Virginia, others claimed North Carolina. Some even whispered he was hiding in plain sight, watching as the empire he helped build was torn apart, brick by brick. But the truth was simpler, and sadder. Silk wasn't running because he feared prison. He was running because he couldn't bear to face what had become of everything he stood for. The betrayal had broken something inside him. The man who had once been defined by purpose now moved through the world like a shadow of himself. And still, he never spoke Alpo's name aloud. Not once. Not in anger, not in sorrow. He simply carried the silence. The manhunt for Wayne "Silk" Perry became one of the most intense in the city's history. Federal agencies poured resources into tracking his movements, offering rewards, and circulating his photo across multiple states. But for months, he remained out of reach, a ghost who refused to be captured by the same system his friend had chosen to serve. Then, one humid afternoon, the story finally reached its breaking point. Acting on a tip, law enforcement cornered him near a quiet apartment complex. There was no dramatic chase, no shootout. Silk didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hands, calm as always, and said, "You got me." It was over. For the first time in years, the city exhaled. The legend of Wayne "Silk" Perry, the silent enforcer, the man who had been both feared and respected, had come to its end on the same streets that had made him. But in that quiet surrender, there was something almost poetic. Even in defeat, Silk carried himself with the same calm dignity that had always defined him. He didn't beg. He didn't explain. He accepted his fate the same way he had accepted every other part of his life, with silence, with principle, with the heavy stillness of a man who understood that every choice has a cost. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the agents expected anger or regret. Instead, Silk just nodded once and said softly, "Everybody gotta answer for something." And as they led him away, the streets, those same streets that had once echoed with his name, fell silent once more. Because in the end, even legends have to face the truth. And Wayne "Silk" Perry, for all his power and fearlessness, was no exception. The courtroom was colder than the streets ever were. It wasn't the temperature, it was the atmosphere, the emptiness that settled in as Wayne "Silk" Perry, the man who had ruled Washington, D.C.'s underworld with discipline and quiet authority, was led into the federal courthouse in handcuffs. Gone were the designer suits, the gold watches, the confident stride that once made men move out of his way. In their place stood a man dressed in a plain jumpsuit, wrists shackled, eyes calm and unreadable. But even stripped of everything, the money, the power, the legend, Silk still carried a presence that filled the room. The trial was the culmination of years of investigation, of whispered betrayals and mounting evidence. And at its heart was the ultimate twist: Alpo Martinez, once his brother, now the government's star witness. The same man Silk had protected, the man he had risked his life for, now sat on the other side of the courtroom, ready to testify against him. The symbolism was brutal. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was the final unraveling of one of the most infamous partnerships the streets had ever seen. When the proceedings began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat, sketch artists worked furiously, and every eye was fixed on the two men whose names had become legend. The federal prosecutor, a calm but ruthless presence, began with a statement that echoed through the room like a death sentence. Wayne Perry, he said, wasn't just a hitman. He was an architect of violence. He ran his life like a business, efficient, cold, and deadly. He enforced Alpo Martinez's empire, and when the empire fell, he left a trail of bodies behind. The prosecution painted Silk as the ultimate enforcer, a man who had turned violence into a craft, whose discipline made him more dangerous than the chaos around him. They brought witnesses, photographs, and transcripts. Each piece of evidence was another stone in the wall they were building around him. But the most damning testimony came from Alpo himself. When Alpo took the stand, the air in the room changed. People leaned forward. The silence was heavy. Dressed neatly, his once slick demeanor dulled by months of custody, he adjusted the microphone and began to speak. His voice was steady, rehearsed, but beneath it, there was something hollow, a kind of emptiness that even his words couldn't hide. He told the court about the deals, the hierarchy, the money. About how Silk handled enforcement, about the fear he commanded, about the hits that kept their empire in line. He described in detail how decisions were made, how disputes were settled, how Silk was his right hand. The more he spoke, the more surreal it became, a man who had once trusted Silk with his life now dismantling that same life, piece by piece, under oath. Silk sat motionless through it all. No visible emotion. No reaction. He didn't flinch when Alpo mentioned names, didn't look away when he described murders, didn't respond when he recounted their conversations. To the jurors, it seemed as though Silk was listening to someone describe a stranger. Only once, when Alpo said, "He was the most loyal man I ever had," did Silk's eyes shift slightly. For a brief moment, the calm cracked, and behind it was something deep and unspoken, not anger, but disappointment. When the prosecution finished, Silk's defense attorney rose to cross-examine. "Mr. Martinez," he began, "you say Mr. Perry was loyal to you, correct?" Alpo nodded cautiously. "Yeah. And you also admit that you made deals with federal prosecutors to reduce your own sentence?" "Yes." "So, to be clear," the lawyer said, pacing slowly, "the man who stood by you for years, who protected you, who killed for you, is sitting here facing life in prison, while you, the man who gave him up, are here hoping to save yourself." The room went silent. Alpo hesitated, his composure faltering. "I did what I had to do," he said finally. The lawyer leaned closer. "And he didn't?" The question hung in the air like a ghost. Alpo's eyes dropped. It was a small victory, moral, not legal, but in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood the difference between the two men. One had chosen loyalty until the end. The other had chosen survival. The trial stretched on for weeks. Witnesses came and went. Some testified in fear, others in anger. The prosecution built a meticulous narrative, a timeline of hits, betrayals, and movements, each leading back to Silk. The defense argued that much of the testimony was built on deals with criminals desperate to save themselves. But the evidence was overwhelming. In private, federal agents admitted they had never seen someone like Silk. He was composed, intelligent, and unerringly calm. He didn't speak out of turn, didn't show frustration. He seemed resigned, not broken, not defiant, just accepting. One investigator later said, "It was like he knew from the start how this story was going to end." When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent. The judge read the charges one by one: conspiracy to distribute narcotics, murder in aid of racketeering, firearms offenses, continuing criminal enterprise. For each count, the jury foreman's answer was the same: guilty. Silk didn't react. No sigh, no shake of the head. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something inevitable. The judge's voice was grave as he delivered the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A sentence meant to erase a man from the world. But erasing Wayne "Silk" Perry was never going to be that simple. After the sentencing, a journalist asked a federal agent how they finally caught him. The agent's answer was simple: "We didn't catch him. His loyalty did." It was true. Silk's code, the same discipline that had made him untouchable, had also been his undoing. He had refused to betray his principles, even when betrayal might have saved him. As he was led out of the courtroom, Alpo turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at Silk. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, two men who had built an empire together, now standing on opposite sides of fate. Alpo looked away first. Silk didn't. He just kept walking, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any words could have been. That night, the news ran the story across every major outlet: Wayne "Silk" Perry sentenced to life in prison, Alpo testifies against former enforcer. To the world, it was the end of an era, the closing of a bloody chapter in D.C.'s criminal history. To the streets, it was something deeper, a cautionary tale written in betrayal, loyalty, and consequence. And somewhere in a federal holding cell, Wayne Perry sat alone, the hum of fluorescent lights above him, thinking not about his sentence, but about the choices that had led him there. He had lived by a code, one that said loyalty was everything. And though that code had cost him his freedom, he would never regret it. Because in a world where men traded integrity for convenience, where even kings turned into informants to save themselves, Silk still had one thing left that no one could take: his word. And that, for him, was enough. The first night in federal prison was unlike any other. The silence wasn't the kind that brought peace, it was heavy, suffocating, the kind that pressed against the walls and followed you wherever you went. Wayne "Silk" Perry sat alone on his bunk, the thin mattress creaking beneath his weight, the hum of fluorescent lights echoing in the narrow cell. The metal bars cast long shadows across the concrete floor, lines that seemed to stretch into infinity. For the first time in his life, the man who had once commanded fear and respect in every corner of Washington, D.C., was confined to a space no larger than a walk-in closet. And yet, in that silence, there was something familiar, the same stillness he had carried through the chaos of the streets. It was almost poetic, the way peace returned to him only after everything else had been taken away. Days in prison blurred together. The rhythm was simple: count times, meals, the echo of boots on concrete, and the occasional clang of cell doors closing in unison. But for someone like Silk, who had lived by instinct, order, and discipline, the structure wasn't punishment. It was routine. He adapted the way he always had, quietly, methodically. He didn't complain, didn't argue, didn't speak more than necessary. He became a ghost in a world already filled with them. Guards noted how calm he was, how his presence alone seemed to command respect even behind bars. Other inmates kept their distance at first, wary of his reputation, the stories that followed him like shadows, stories of loyalty, silence, and death. Over time, those who shared space with him began to see the man behind the myth. Silk wasn't loud, didn't brag about his past. He spoke when he needed to, his words slow, deliberate, often philosophical. In a place where bravado was currency, his silence carried the most weight. "The streets ain't a place," he once said to a younger inmate. "It's a mindset. And if you don't leave it behind, it'll follow you wherever you go." That sentence lingered in the air like smoke, not advice, but a warning carved from experience. There was something strangely peaceful about his existence now. For the first time in decades, he didn't have to look over his shoulder. There were no corners to guard, no rivals to fear, no loyalty tests to pass. The battles were all behind him. The war was over. He was, in a way, free, though trapped within walls of steel and concrete. Freedom had always been a strange concept to men like him. It wasn't about space, it was about state of mind. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the rest of the prison slept, Silk would sit by the small, barred window and stare out into the darkness. Sometimes he'd see stars, faint and distant through the light pollution. Sometimes only the reflection of his own face, older now, the lines deeper, the eyes still sharp. He'd think about the streets he once ruled, the people who were gone, the ones who betrayed him, and the ones who still spoke his name with reverence. Every legend eventually turns into a memory, and every memory fades into silence. But some silences, like his, never lose their power. He spent much of his time reading philosophy, history, religion, subjects that had nothing to do with the streets but everything to do with understanding himself. There was something almost ironic about a man once known for taking lives now spending his days studying the meaning of existence. He read Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor who wrote about inner peace amidst chaos. He underlined a passage that said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." It was as if the words had been written for him. Even within prison walls, Silk maintained a quiet code of conduct. He avoided conflicts, never aligned with any particular group, and stayed neutral in the politics that ruled the yard. To some, that made him mysterious, to others, untouchable. But those who got close enough to talk with him saw something they didn't expect, not arrogance, but reflection. A man who understood exactly what he had become and accepted it without excuse. There were moments, though rare, when the past crept in. Late at night, a certain sound, a distant shout, the clatter of metal, would trigger memories of D.C.'s streets. He'd see flashes of his old life, a dimly lit alley, the hum of an engine, the weight of a pistol resting in his palm. He'd remember the faces of men who once swore they'd die before they'd turn, and the hollow realization that most of them didn't keep their word. Those thoughts didn't bring anger anymore, just a quiet understanding. The streets had taken what they wanted, and he had given the rest willingly. Letters came from time to time, from people who claimed to admire him, from old friends, from young men who looked up to him as some sort of street philosopher. He read every one, though he rarely replied. The words were always the same: "You're a legend. You never snitched. You stayed solid." They meant it as praise, but to Silk, it was bittersweet. He knew what it really meant, that his silence had become a symbol, not because it brought him peace, but because it was so rare in a world where loyalty had become extinct. In one letter, a young man wrote, "I want to be like you." Silk read it twice, then folded the paper neatly and put it away. That night, he wrote a reply, one of the few he ever sent. His handwriting was steady, precise, the same way he spoke. He wrote, "Don't be like me. Be better. I made choices that can't be undone. The streets don't love you back. They never did. What looks like respect is really fear. What looks like loyalty disappears when the time comes. Learn from me, don't repeat me." He signed it simply, Silk. That letter would later circulate around prisons and street circles, becoming almost as legendary as the man himself. It wasn't bravado. It was truth, the kind that comes only when you have nothing left to prove. As the years passed, Silk aged quietly. His body grew slower, his hair turned gray, but his mind remained sharp. Inmates who arrived decades after his sentencing still whispered his name with awe, as though they were standing near a ghost from another era. They'd ask him questions, seek his advice, listen to his calm voice explain things they'd never heard before. Discipline, he would tell them, isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself. Sometimes, he'd sit in the yard under the weak sun, eyes closed, the faint sound of distant conversations blending into the wind. The world outside had changed, the empire he once served was gone, the people who once feared him were dead, and even the city that raised him no longer remembered his name. And yet, here he was, the last quiet remnant of an age when loyalty meant something, when silence was sacred. In that stillness, Silk Perry found something he had never known before, peace. Not redemption, he didn't seek forgiveness, but understanding. The kind that comes when a man looks back at the wreckage of his life and finally sees it for what it was. He didn't regret the code he lived by. He only regretted that it led him exactly where it was always meant to, a life lived with honor, ending in solitude. And in that solitude, Wayne Silk Perry remained exactly who he had always been, calm, composed, and unbroken. The world outside might have moved on, but within those walls, his legend breathed quietly, not in the stories of violence, but in the silence of a man who had made peace with the weight of his own choices. Years had passed. The world outside the walls kept spinning, new music, new slang, new kings of the streets, but inside, time slowed until it almost stood still. For Wayne Silk Perry, prison had become not just a sentence, but a mirror, a place where the reflections of his past visited him in flashes and whispers. Each day was predictable, yet each night carried a different kind of weight. It was in those quiet hours, when the cell block dimmed and the hum of distant voices faded, that the memories crept in, the laughter, the sirens, the sound of rain on car roofs in D.C., the smell of gasoline and gunpowder. The ghosts of his old life came not to haunt, but to remind. He often found himself replaying certain moments like old film reels, sharp and vivid. The first time he'd met Alpo Martinez, two men shaking hands, both seeing a reflection of themselves in the other. The nights they drove through the city, the neon lights bouncing off their windshields as the empire they built grew larger and darker. The code they'd sworn to live by. And the final moments when that same code was broken, not by him, but by the one he'd called brother. There was no hatred left in him now, only clarity. Time, it seemed, had stripped away everything but truth. In one of his letters to a friend, he wrote, "Forgiveness ain't weakness. It's understanding. You can't hate a man forever for doing what fear made him do." That line revealed something that even his closest allies had never seen, a man who had stopped measuring life by loyalty and betrayal, and started measuring it by peace and acceptance. Still, even peace came with its challenges. Prison was filled with young men who walked like they had something to prove, talking about loyalty, codes, and respect without understanding the cost of any of it. They approached Silk like a prophet, asking about the bold days, about Alpo, about the empire. They wanted stories, the kind that made them feel close to the legend. But when they came, Silk didn't give them what they wanted. He didn't glorify. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the truth. The streets don't have happy endings, he'd say, his tone low and steady. They only got fast ones. You either die or you sit where I'm sitting, thinking about all the chances you had to walk away. His words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they came from a man who had lived through the myth they still believed in. It was strange to him, the way young men still romanticized a world that had taken everything from him. They thought the streets were a story of power. But for Silk, it was always a story of survival, of discipline, of choices that left scars no one could see. Sometimes, when he spoke to the younger inmates, they'd ask him if he missed it, the rush, the money, the respect. He'd pause before answering, eyes distant, almost nostalgic. I missed the silence before the storm, he'd say. The calm before everything happened. But the rest? Nah. The rest was just noise pretending to be life. As the years rolled on, Silk's name began to take on a new kind of meaning. Outside prison walls, documentaries were made. Street legends were retold on YouTube channels and podcasts. Rappers mentioned him in lyrics. To some, he was still the ultimate enforcer, the man who never folded, who kept his code intact even when the world around him didn't. To others, he had become a cautionary tale, the embodiment of what loyalty could cost. But to Silk himself, he was just a man, flawed, human, and tired of being both hero and villain in a story that never seemed to end. When word reached him that Alpo Martinez had been killed in Harlem, decades after their fallout, Silk said nothing. The news spread quickly through the prison. Inmates whispered about it, trading rumors and reactions. Some said it was justice, others said it was fate catching up. But when one of the younger inmates told Silk the news directly, he simply nodded and whispered, "The streets always finish what they start." Then he went back to his bunk, folded his hands, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Later that night, he wrote a few lines in his notebook, a habit he had developed over the years. He rarely shared what he wrote, but his words were sharp and haunting, like echoes of lessons carved from pain. He wrote, "Loyalty and betrayal are twins. You can't have one without risking the other. The only thing that lives longer than either is consequence." It was strange how death outside the prison could stir something inside. It wasn't grief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was closure. The story that had begun on the streets of D.C. had finally found its final punctuation. The man who had betrayed him was gone, and yet, Silk felt no triumph, only the stillness of inevitability. In the years that followed, that stillness became his comfort. He no longer needed validation from the world beyond the walls. The legend lived its own life out there, told and retold by voices that had never met him. He understood that every retelling added a new layer, some truth, some fiction, but it didn't matter. The man he had been and the man they remembered were no longer the same. The myth was theirs, the piece was his. When asked once by a journalist doing a piece on his story if he had any regrets, he thought for a long moment before answering. His voice was calm, reflective. "I regret thinking the streets could give me something permanent. They gave me a name, sure. But names fade. The streets don't remember you, people do. And most of them don't stay long enough to." That statement was one of the last public words ever attributed to him, and it said everything about who Wayne Perry had become. A man who once thrived in motion had found meaning in stillness. A man once known for his silence now used it as a form of wisdom. In his later years behind bars, Silk spent much of his time mentoring others, quietly passing on the discipline and philosophy that had defined his life. Not the violence, not the fear, but the understanding that strength without control is just destruction waiting for direction. To some, he became a mentor, to others, a mystery. Even the guards treated him with a quiet respect, aware that they were in the presence of someone whose legend had transcended the bars that confined him. At night, when the prison grew silent and only the hum of the lights remained, Silk would close his eyes and let his mind drift. He'd picture D.C. as it used to be, the cracked streets glistening after rain, the sound of distant sirens blending with laughter, the smell of the city alive with danger and rhythm. It was a world gone forever, and he knew it. But in those memories, he found something close to peace. Because for Wayne "Silk" Perry, peace was never about forgetting who he was. It was about finally understanding why he had to become him. The seasons inside prison didn't change the way they did outside. There were no blooming springs, no summer heat waves, no autumn leaves falling from trees. Only the shifting temperature of the air and the faint difference in light through the narrow window of his cell. Yet somehow, Wayne "Silk" Perry could feel time moving, not in days or years, but in the way faces changed around him. The young men who entered the system wide-eyed and reckless began to gray around the edges. Guards were replaced by newer ones who only knew his name from stories. And through it all, Silk remained steady, like a monument inside a world built to erode everything. By the time the new millennium settled in, the streets that once whispered his name had changed. Crack had faded, new drugs had taken its place, and the codes that once governed D.C.'s underworld were now diluted, scattered like ashes. On television, new gangsters appeared, loud, careless, flashing money in ways that made the old code seem like a forgotten language. But even from inside, Silk could see the pattern repeating. The faces were new, the technology advanced, but the story was always the same: men chasing power they couldn't control, mistaking fear for respect, loyalty for ownership. It was as though the streets never learned, they only recycled. In the yard, Silk watched the younger inmates with quiet observation. They were quick, restless, always talking about who ran what corner, who was next to blow up, who kept it real. He saw himself in them, the fire, the ambition, the belief that they could beat the system. But he also saw their fate, written clearly in the same arrogance that had once driven him. When they finally came to him, respectfully, nervously, asking for advice, he didn't give lectures. He gave silence first. He'd let it sit between them until it grew heavy enough for them to feel it. Then, in that silence, he'd speak softly. "You think loyalty's gonna save you," he'd say. "But loyalty don't mean nothing when you give it to the wrong people. The only thing that saves you is knowing when to walk away, and being man enough to do it." His words carried weight not because of who he had been, but because of who he still was, a man who had lived every lesson he spoke. Those who listened deeply enough began to change. They stopped glorifying the chaos and started asking deeper questions about survival, about peace, about purpose. Over time, a small circle formed around Silk, not a gang, not followers, but students. They called him Old Man Silk, though to many, he was more like a quiet teacher than a legend. He guided them not with threats or orders, but with examples of discipline, patience, and acceptance. Prison officials noticed the effect. Violence lessened in his unit. Disputes that would have ended in bloodshed were instead talked out after Silk intervened. One warden described him as a stabilizer, someone who brings calm just by being there. And though no official record ever called him that, it was true. Wayne Perry, once the architect of fear, had become the keeper of peace. He never claimed to be reformed, that word didn't sit right with him. He didn't apologize for his past, nor did he justify it. When asked by a prison chaplain one day if he had found God, Silk smiled faintly and said, "God found me a long time ago. I just wasn't ready to listen." In time, he began to write more, long letters, journal entries, reflections. Some were sent out to old friends, others to community workers who ran youth programs in D.C. They began reading his words in classrooms, juvenile centers, even podcasts. His tone was calm, measured, the same voice that once gave orders now gave guidance. In one letter that circulated widely, he wrote, "Everybody wants to be remembered. But not everyone deserves to be. What you do when you're young feels big, but the world forgets fast. The only thing that lasts is the truth of who you were when nobody was watching. That's what defines you, not the name they say after you're gone." The letter went viral in street circles, not because it was poetic, but because it was painfully honest. Young men who once admired Silk Street legend began to quote his words online. Some called him a philosopher, others said he had evolved. But for Silk, it wasn't about evolution, it was about clarity. He had lived through every illusion the streets could sell, and he had survived long enough to see through them all. Sometimes, he'd sit in his cell and listen to the faint hum of the radio. News about D.C. would come through, neighborhoods changing, gentrification pushing the old streets into memory. The corners where he once walked no longer existed in the same way. The people were different, the rhythm softer. Even the sound of the city had changed. "That's how it should be," he once said quietly to another inmate. "No street deserves to stay the same forever. Too much blood on those blocks." There was one particular night when Silk's calm broke for just a moment. He received a letter from someone he hadn't heard from in years, the mother of one of the men whose life he had taken long ago. Her handwriting was shaky, the ink faded in places. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't even vengeful. It simply said, "I don't forgive what you did. But I pray that you found peace, because hating you all these years hasn't brought my son back." He read it over and over. The words settled in him like stones sinking to the bottom of deep water. That night, for the first time in decades, he wept quietly, not from guilt, not from regret, but from the weight of realization. There are no winners in the life he had chosen. Only survivors. And even survival came with a cost that never truly faded. In the morning, he wrote a reply, short, careful, almost like a prayer. "I can't undo what I did. I live with it every day. I hope my peace doesn't offend you, but I promise it came slow. If I could trade it for your son's breath, I would." He never knew if she received it. But in writing it, something in him shifted, a quiet acceptance that his story, like every man's story, was made of both harm and healing. In the following years, Silk's health began to decline. The long years of confinement, the sleepless nights, and the stress of survival began to weigh on his body. Yet even as his strength faded, his mind remained sharp, his tone calm. Younger inmates often visited his cell for advice. He never turned them away. He'd listen, nod, and end most conversations the same way: "Stay solid, but don't stay stuck." That phrase became a kind of mantra, a soft code for a new generation, a bridge between the life he lived and the lessons he left behind. And as the years quietly folded into decades, Wayne "Silk" Perry, once the silent enforcer of D.C.'s most feared empire, had become something far greater than the myth he once embodied. He had become a teacher, a cautionary poet, a man who had made peace with his past by understanding it, not escaping it. In the stillness of his cell, beneath the low hum of fluorescent light, he often sat with his eyes closed, not in regret, not in prayer, but in peace. Because for the first time in his life, he understood something that power, fear, and reputation had never taught him, that the quiet you earn after chaos is the truest kind of freedom. Time had become a quiet companion to Wayne "Silk" Perry. Years inside the walls of federal prison had stripped away the noise of the life he once lived, the adrenaline, the danger, the constant edge between survival and destruction. What remained was a man no longer defined by fear, but by reflection. In his younger days, Silk had lived by a strict code: loyalty above everything, silence above all. It was a rulebook written in blood and reinforced by betrayal. Breaking the code meant death. But now, sitting in a small cell surrounded by stillness, Silk began to see that the code he once obeyed without question had both built and broken him. He still believed in loyalty, but not to men, or gangs, or power. Now, it was loyalty to truth. "The streets taught me how to live," he once wrote in a letter, "but time taught me how to think." He had started to write more seriously. His notebook, worn and filled with reflections, became both a confessional and a conversation with his younger self. He wrote about everything: the psychology of street life, the illusion of control, the pain behind pride. His tone was calm, reflective, and deeply honest. "Ain't nobody untouchable," one entry read. "We all fall. The question is, do you rise different?" As he wrote, something shifted within him. He no longer saw the past as a curse, but as a mirror. The choices that had once haunted him became lessons, each mistake a brick in the foundation of the man he was becoming. He didn't run from his past anymore, he studied it. Younger inmates started to notice. Some would stop by his cell just to talk, to ask questions, to listen. At first, Silk resisted being seen as a mentor. He wasn't trying to preach, he was still figuring things out himself. But gradually, he accepted that his survival carried meaning for others. The same reputation that once fueled fear now commanded respect of a different kind. He told them stories, not to glorify the streets, but to expose the emptiness behind the glamour. He spoke softly, his words deliberate. "You think money and power make you free?" he'd say. "They don't. They chain you in ways you can't even see." One young man asked him what changed, what made him stop living the life. Silk paused for a long moment before replying. "I got tired of losing everything that mattered: respect, trust, peace. You reach a point where even fear gets old." At night, when the cell block quieted, he would sit by the window, staring at the faint glow of the outside lights. The world kept moving, but he was no longer chasing it. In that stillness, he felt something close to freedom, not of the body, but of the mind. His reflections reached beyond the prison walls through letters exchanged with journalists, activists, and even former rivals. Some wrote to thank him for his insight. Others asked if he regretted his past. His response was always measured: "Regret's heavy. Understanding is lighter. I live with understanding." Silk's transformation didn't erase his past, it redefined it. The silence that once made him feared now made him wise. The same discipline that had fueled his violence now guided his peace. The man who once enforced death was now teaching life. As time moved forward, his reputation evolved. In the outside world, his name became a symbol, not just of brutality, but of change. People began to speak of Wayne "Silk" Perry as the man who found clarity where others found chaos, who turned prison into a classroom, and who rewrote the code that had once ruled his existence. And though the world continued to spin without him, Silk had made peace with his place in it. His words, his silence, his calm, they had all become part of something larger than fear. He had rewritten the code. And this time, it was written in truth, not blood. Years had passed quietly behind the prison walls. Wayne "Silk" Perry had changed, not just in age, but in spirit. The once feared enforcer of Washington, D.C., now lived in silence and discipline, his days shaped by routine and reflection. Gone were the restless nights and violent impulses, in their place came a steady rhythm of acceptance. His cell had become his sanctuary. Neat, organized, almost meditative. Each morning, he read, wrote, and prayed. The man who once ruled through fear now sought peace through understanding. Younger inmates often came to him for advice, drawn by the quiet strength he carried. They didn't see the killer anymore, they saw a man who had survived his own destruction. At times, Silk would sit by the narrow window, watching sunlight spill across the gray concrete. The view never changed, yet he found meaning in its simplicity. He often thought about the streets of D.C., the ones that had made him, betrayed him, and finally forgotten him. He no longer blamed them. "The streets don't change," he once told a fellow inmate. "We just grow out of them, or we don't." Through letters, he began sharing his reflections, not confessions, but lessons. His words reached beyond the walls, touching people who had only known his name through fear. Now, they saw something different: transformation. Silk understood that peace wasn't about freedom or forgiveness, it was about balance. To accept what was done. To live what remained. In that stillness, he found clarity. The violence that had once defined him had dissolved into wisdom. And as he wrote late into the night, his pen moving slowly across paper, one truth guided every line: a man's real power begins when his ego ends. In the quiet rhythm of prison life, Wayne "Silk" Perry had found a kind of peace that the streets had never offered. His days were calm, almost meditative, writing letters, reflecting, and mentoring younger inmates who saw him not as a myth, but as a teacher. The same silence that once protected him on the streets had become his sanctuary within the walls. He spent hours writing, his pen gliding steadily across pages filled with thoughts on loyalty, manhood, and redemption. He no longer sought power, he sought understanding. The rage and restlessness of his youth had softened into wisdom, a quiet that spoke louder than fear ever did. Occasionally, letters reached him from the outside, from young men who said his story made them think twice, from mothers thanking him for words that guided their sons. These small connections became his new kind of respect, one built not on control, but on peace. At night, as the lights dimmed and the hum of the cell block grew faint, Silk would sit by the window, staring at the distant stars through steel bars. "It's funny," he once said to a fellow inmate, "how I had to lose everything to find myself." The man who once lived by the gun now lived by reflection. In that stillness, Silk understood that the most powerful kind of silence was not one of fear, but one of peace. With age, Silk became a quiet legend within the prison, not as a feared hitman, but as a philosopher. His presence carried a calm authority, a gravity born from survival and self-awareness. Inmates sought him out for advice, and guards treated him with rare respect. He spent his days writing and teaching, turning fragments of his past into lessons. "Power fades," he would say, "but peace, that stays if you earn it." His words traveled beyond the prison walls through letters, podcasts, and youth programs. Ironically, the man once known for silence had found his true voice in reflection. One day, a young chaplain who had known him for years visited again. "Do you think you found redemption?" he asked. Silk smiled faintly. "Redemption ain't about erasing your past. It's about understanding it, and living different because of it." By then, he had long accepted his fate. He knew he would likely die inside those walls, but his spirit had already escaped. The once cold silence that surrounded him had transformed into peace, a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of a man who had finally stopped running. To those around him, Wayne Perry was no longer Silk, the enforcer. He was a man who had turned violence into wisdom, proof that even the hardest souls could still find light in the dark. In his final years, Silk grew frail, but his calm never wavered. He still wrote each morning, still offered quiet advice to anyone who asked. His cell remained spotless, his notebook always open, filled with words that carried more power than bullets ever had. When asked if he regretted his past, he would smile softly. "Every man pays for the life he builds," he said. "But if you can leave the world softer than you found it, that's peace." He often spoke of D.C., not with bitterness, but nostalgia, the city of his youth, the streets that had both raised and destroyed him. He no longer sought to rewrite history. He simply wished to be remembered not for his violence, but for what he learned after it. One quiet morning, as sunlight broke across the prison yard, Wayne "Silk" Perry passed away in his chair, peaceful, eyes closed, as if in deep thought. The guards found his final notebook open beside him. On its last page were his final words: "Don't remember me for what I did. Remember me for what I understood." Outside those gray walls, D.C. kept moving, new stories, new names. But among those who remembered him, there was silence, not the kind born of fear, but of respect. The man who had once ruled the streets through terror had left behind something greater: stillness, wisdom, and a lasting whisper of redemption.